Leadership Conference. We're here this week with support from the Bob Woodruff Foundation, and we thank them for their longstanding commitment and support. My name is Julianne Mills. I'm a program manager at Move United, and I'm here today as the host of our session with Nate Hansen from Adaptive Sports Partners of the North Country. Today we'll be talking about the volunteer leader. Before I hand things off to Nate, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items and reminders about using Zoom. Everyone that's entering the webinar is muted and there's no cameras on except for ours. So you're welcome to use the chat box to communicate with us and other attendees. Just be sure that your chat box is set to send to all attendees and panelists. If you want to introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining from today, that can come in through the chat box. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A feature, that's a button on the bottom of your window, and submit your questions for Nate. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can at the end of today's presentation. And with that, I want to go ahead and hand things off to you, Nate, and take it away.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been an amazing week with Move United, and I'm honored to be here as part of it. So a quick disclaimer, although I tried several items or several times, I was not able to get subtitles to work. So unfortunately right now those are not available, but otherwise we should be good to go. So today we're going to be talking about the volunteer leader. Our objectives today are what is a volunteer leader, how can a volunteer leader help your program, how to support a volunteer leader program, and how to evaluate the volunteer leader program. So I was just recently hired as the program manager for Adaptive Sports Partners of the North Country. Before that, I was a volunteer leader, so I have some unique perspective on both sides that hopefully I can bring to you and kind of give you an idea of what it might be like to use this model. This all started for us one summer when we didn't have any interns, and our interns were running our summer programming. And so then we were left to kind of scramble to see how we could cover our programming. And this is what we started with, and then we decided we wanted to make it a more formal program. So I do want to start by telling you a little bit about ASPNC, because I'm going to reference our program here a lot as I go through the presentation. So we're a young, fairly small program in our 11th year. We have 2 full-time staff, 2 part-time staff, a little over 125 volunteers. We offer 17 programs, give or take, depending on the year, year-round, and we typically run a 6 or 8-week session. We do also provide some private and one-off lessons, but we really kind of thrive on our seasonal sessions. While we were designing our volunteer leader program, we made this lovely organizational chart that kind of had our dream list of staff. It looks really great, but in reality, the executive director and the program manager are our only full-time staff. So obviously, like many programs, that means we can only do so much. We do have an Alpine coordinator and an info operations manager that are part-time, and that's great. They help us out a ton, but ideally we'd love to have more. All of the purple, those are all volunteer positions, and you can see we have the volunteer leader kind of on that same level of the interns running our programming. So what is the volunteer leader? For us at ASPNC, the volunteer leader is that liaison or point of contact between our volunteers, our participants, our venue partners, the office, the service organizations on the day of that bring our participants. They're the go-to person for us. They're the lead partner that facilitate our programming. They're responsible for the safety of it and just the general flow. For most of our programs, there isn't someone from the office available to be at all of our programming. So they're really that lead person for us. They can also answer questions, give feedback, adjust equipment, kind of the do-it-all, make sure everything runs person. So the volunteer leader for us their responsibilities start at the beginning of the season. They provide the training for that session. So all of our seasonal programs will have, the week before we'll have a training. They run all of that. They coordinate all of the day-to-day activity. Like I said, staff is most likely not there, so they're really in charge of making sure we have a good, successful day. Safety is their number one concern, to make sure that everybody's safe, volunteers, participants. They do assist in the pairing of which volunteers work with which participants, although we like to make that a joint effort. Our volunteer leaders don't always know the ins and outs of what our volunteers or participants who they want to work with or what lessons they want to be on. So that one can be tricky to have the volunteer leader do. And they get to be responsible for everybody's favorite, the paperwork side of things. After our lessons, they make sure everybody does their progress notes, checks everybody's, participant packets to make sure those are being reviewed. So they have that fun responsibility too. So when we decided that we wanted to have volunteer leaders, we needed to decide what type of responsibility we would put on them. Since they are truly kind of running our program and we gave them a lot of responsibility for us. This is of course something that can be tailored to your program. You can, put as much or as little on as you want. But the first thing we decide is that they need to be trained in our office specific training. So for us, we use a 3-ring binder for our attendance, our information on our participants, all of the day-to-day forms that they might need. We wanted to make sure they were familiar with all of that. That could be an online platform for you if you have that at your disposal. Since they're in charge of our safety as well, CPR and first aid became an important thing for them to be certified in. Obviously, we'd like to have all volunteers trained in that, but the only ones that we require to be trained are the volunteer leaders. Since we run seasonal programming, we did want our volunteer leaders to have at least one season under their belt. Now, I think that's really dependent upon the program that we're talking about. If we look at our alpine programming, that's a very in-depth program that requires a lot of technical kind of skill and knowledge. So we probably wouldn't put that 1 year kind of seasoned alpine volunteer in that position, versus our walking program could be, a little easier for someone to start out with and run. And so we did also want to look for that commitment that they could be with us through that 6 or 8 week season, for the consistency for not only our volunteers, but the participants that'll be coming to programming. Why have the volunteer leader program? So for us, it really opened up the ability to host multiple programs at one time. Before the volunteer leader, it was our executive director running all of our programming with the interns, and we all know that one person just can't do all of that. It becomes too much, you get burnt out, and it's not a sustainable model. So it freed up our staff to oversee other programs or other endeavors that they needed to be working on. The other thing that we found was it allowed for a system of growth for our volunteers. A lot of our volunteers kind of enjoyed the challenge and having the pathway to develop themselves and grow and take on a more meaningful role in the program. So it allowed for that deeper level of engagement. So when you've decided that you want to have a volunteer leader program, we started by identifying the potential programs that we wanted. For us, we decided that if we could find the right people, all of our programs would be to some level run at the volunteer level. Really, Alpine's the only one where staff is still kind of involved, but we run 6 days of programming. 4 of those are volunteer-led. Like I said, it really depends on your comfort level and the volunteer leader that you get. Identifying who will be the volunteer leader can often be one of the trickiest parts. When we started, there was 2 of us that volunteered. After that, finding people became slightly more challenging. Even though we had amazing volunteers that were already doing that basic role, they didn't want to feel like they had that extra responsibility. So that can be a challenge. Then we wanted to identify what responsibility they would have. And I think the key is to not overload them. And then to not overload them, we wanted to build a support system to make sure that they felt comfortable in this new position. In the picture here, the volunteers are one of our volunteer leaders for Alpine out making a day on the slopes happen. So then we built the volunteer job description. For us, we included, and I'd recommend having that title, what your key responsibilities are, what training they will need, what support they will get, the skills and qualifications, and the benefits. And we're going to take a look at our job description. So obviously put right in the title that we call them volunteer leaders. I've heard other programs use supervisors, but we put that they'll work with the program manager to coordinate and work with the volunteers for whatever sport or recreation. Those key responsibilities come from one of the earlier slides, that they're the liaison for us. And what we hoped our initial impact would be was to ensure high quality programming that was fun and safe. It enabled a variety of programs to be run at the same time. And that was kind of really what we initially needed. But what we found was, over the sustained outcomes, is that we were building a better adaptive community in our area. Our programming was viewed as better organized, and just the level of programming, we were able to raise that bar now that we could, function at multiple sites at the same time. Training, you see the same venue book, CPR, anything that's relevant to our training. Support, we'll talk about later in more detail, but how we'll support them. For skills and qualifications, like I said, we did want that at least one season. Ideally, they'd come with multiple seasons or some other kind of background in that sport. Obviously, they also need to be a good leader to be able to manage all of the people, participants, and the safety. And we wanted to outline that we kind of expect volunteer leaders will be the first one there, the last one to leave, to make sure that everything's taken care of. But we also kind of wanted to show the benefits, that there was something in this for the volunteer as well, that they could have some growth, feel like they were more involved and doing more for the community. If you want to see all of these in more depth, let me know after and I can get those to you. Supporting the volunteer leader, like I said, was super key for us. We don't want to end up like this poor guy in the picture here, all frazzled. So we decided that our office would continue to handle all of the behind the scenes work. This was the way we had been operating. So the office would find the volunteers to be there, they would find the participants, and they would develop SOPs for our volunteer leaders to follow. SOPs are super important. So standard operating procedures or standard operating guidelines. We wanted to have some guidelines and procedures that our volunteer leaders could follow, and basically to try to make it a little less gray and more black and white. We wanted them, when they had to make a decision, that, especially if it wasn't going to be a popular one, to have some backing so that they would feel comfortable making that tough decision to cancel a lesson or, stop because of weather. So we're going to look at some of those. To start, we made a sport-specific SOP because we wanted to go into more detail for each sport. And since hopefully we'll have some biking here this summer, we're going to look at the biking SOP. So a lot of this top part looks familiar from kind of what we've already looked at, but I wanted to point out in our training requirements, you see the same ones from the job description, but here we've also included a sport-specific one. Our local bike shop offers a mechanics class, and we want our volunteer leaders to have gone through that so they're able to work with all of the equipment that they'll be faced with. Right off in our SOPs, you'll see that our medical or injury section is one of the top ones. So you can see that we have it in red, refer to injury or accident SOP. The red refers to the fact that there could be a life threat or some type of injury, illness associated with it. So we really need to pay attention to those SOPs and follow those closely. We will look at the emergency SOP in a minute. One of the other really tough ones to tackle is the minimum staffing protocol. I'm sure, like many other programs that are out there, we're also struggling to find volunteers to staff all of this. Someone calls out sick, whatever it may be. So we wanted to have some verbiage in here to allow them to make that decision of, we can't run this lesson because there's not enough people. I know we often always try to overcome and adapt to the scenario, but we do need to make sure that it's all happening safely. The cancellation policy became really important. We kind of highlighted the lightning SOP so they could refer to that and how to handle that. But we've also run into, like, high heat or super cold where we've needed to cancel some programming. So we wanted them to have some some guidance for that. And then the general portion of the SOP goes into more of the day-to-day and seasonal run-ins. So the top part talks about getting the equipment, the venue book, making sure it's all there and ready to go, coordinating the training, and then how the actual day itself will run, getting set up, and making sure the pairings are complete and everybody knows their assignments, all the way to setting up the safety equipment and breaking it down for the day. We also included an equipment section, since this is an equipment-heavy activity. It talks about just some of the basic maintenance and modifications that you might need to make. And then we added in definitions about all of our different equipment. Safety-related SOPs, obviously super important. We wanted our volunteer leaders to know how to handle any type of emergency situation, you know, at least in a general sense, and the reporting for it so we could track that and hopefully prevent it in the future. In the picture, we're practicing some rescue swimming for our kayak program. It's always fun getting everyone to jump in the cold water in early June. So here's our emergency SOP. We're going to skip over Alpine. This is a kind of broad SOP that covers all programming. But for our non-Alpine, we looked immediately if there's an evident or serious injury or illness to call 911 and get help started. We don't expect that our volunteers are going to be providing a lot of medical care, just simple first aid. If it's someone that isn't the VL, the volunteer is supposed to notify the VL, and they're expected at that point to respond out to the scene and help mitigate that as best they can. One of our volunteers will get their family or CI, whoever brought them to the caregiver, to come assist. And you know, they'll do whatever is needed. If it's minor, they can provide that basic first aid. We did specify that we do not want our volunteer leaders or any volunteers transporting people to the hospital. If that needs to happen, we'll call an ambulance or let the family caregiver, you know, take that role on if they feel it's appropriate. And then we wanted to kind of lay out when we would want that incident report to be done. So obviously if someone was injured, equipment got damaged, someone just feels sore after an event, and although not related to biking, we outlined 2 pieces of our ski equipment that our higher risk participants go in, so we wanted to be notified if there was any incident with those. Some other SOPs that we looked at, our biking program uses a bigger enclosed trailer, so we need to make sure people could drive and back the trailer. Hopefully we're doing better than this guy launching his boat. Like I said, weather was an important one, and because there's a lot of technical pieces of equipment, we felt that an equipment policy would be important. Your program can truly, you know, build this to your needs and wants. You can put in as many or as little as you want. I feel that the more there are, the clearer it gets for the volunteer leader. Communication, this is always the big one. Up here in northern New Hampshire, we don't always have cell phone service. So that's a challenge. As you can see in the picture, sometimes cell phones just don't work. So we knew that we needed to be there to support the volunteer leader as best we can. Since we don't have that cell phone service, that means the office staff needs to be on top of their game and having that venue book ready, the equipment ready, everything that they need to go when they come pick up that trailer or that book, that it's ready and off they go. Because sometimes the most we can do is get a text message out from our venues. Big part of that is making sure everybody knows what venue they're going to. Since we change venues weekly for some of our programming, that can be a big challenge. And just having that paperwork ready to go. So now that we have a volunteer leader program, we know we need to evaluate it to make sure that it has been effective. For us, we decided that this process would actually start before we even start our season. We bring the volunteer leaders in for a pre-season meeting to see what their thoughts are, what their expectations are, and so they can know what our expectations are, so we all start off on the same page. We also wanted to do a mid-season meeting with our volunteer leaders, just to make sure that things were going smoothly and that we could keep things moving in the right direction. Then we wanted to do an end-of-season survey and go over those numbers. For us, our survey, we wanted to get the data not only from participant and volunteers, but the parent or the community integrators, whoever was bringing that participant, And some of these questions are the generic ones you see on like every end of season eval, but there's some specific to ask how the volunteer leader was. Were they prepared to implement programming? Were they able to implement it safely? And did everybody feel engaged? So again, that's one of those ones you can tailor to your program, but we really wanted to get that feedback to make sure that this model was going to work. And of course, we left some open-ended questions to get as much feedback as possible. So we took those survey results and we brought them to the VLs and looked over what went well, what could be improved. And I have our survey results from our first season. And I want to particularly kind of pick on kayaking and biking because they're our two biggest programs. So from a real quick look, you can see in kayaking, everybody rated things really highly except for directions to venues. Kayaking is one of our programs where we're at a venue every week. Sometimes that can be a bit much to keep track of for everybody. So we kind of expected that one to be down. But when we come down to biking, we notice that orange is our volunteers here. They rated several things low across the board. And the volunteer that we have for biking is phenomenal. He does a great job. So then we kind of started to ask ourselves, well, what happened? So we can see they weren't terrible, but it was 4.43, 4.4, 4.25. Why were these numbers low? It's a real simple explanation. We use that metric of the 1 through 5, 5 being awesome, 1 being not. And not everybody followed directions. Several volunteers from biking circled all 1s and then put what a great season it was. So we all chuckled, told that volunteer leader he was our #1 volunteer leader, kind of picked on him about it. But then we did adjust it for his sanity. And although it's a little bit lower, we can see everything's up over 4.5 now. And it kind of explained why his numbers were so low. So for us, we've continued to look at what we can do to grow this program and improve it. One of the big struggles that we've had as a program was having the volunteer leader be on lessons. In the ideal world, the volunteer leader is that big picture person that stepped back. They're there to assist everybody else in getting out, getting equipment ready. And unfortunately, we just can't always do that. We do a pretty good job in the summer and the spring, fall, but once Alpine starts up, we're just too busy. Often our volunteer leaders have a higher technical kind of training level with the equipment. So we just can't afford to not have them on lessons. So this year we're starting to look at how can we improve on that. And so this summer we're rolling out the assistant volunteer leader. And that's someone that will be that second person to help run the day-to-day programming. They could be the person that if the volunteer leader couldn't be there, they could step in. And kind of ideally for us, it gives us a pool of volunteers to look at to become volunteer leaders in the future. And hopefully that will help us kind of rule or find out who is actually interested and get them comfortable. We found that if they weren't comfortable, maybe having a step in the middle would be a better option. So we'll look at that job description really quick. You're going to notice it looks almost identical. We've just changed the title and that they're working directly under the volunteer leader. They still have the same support from the office. They have many of the same responsibilities, but now they're more of an assist so that if that volunteer leader does go out on a lesson, there's still someone there to have that big picture view. We asked that they have similar levels of training with the CPR, first aid, sport-specific training. They did a lot of the same support. Our outcomes were the same. It opened up our programming while giving the volunteers a deeper level of engagement and building our community up. And they had the same skills and qualifications that we'd expect for any of our volunteer leaders. So we're really hopeful and excited to see what this does to open things up. I know that I would have enjoyed this as a volunteer leader, having someone else to help, because there's always that one day where you just can't be there to do something. So that's where we're kind of looking at this to move forward. Now, I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. If anybody needs, wants to go into this or needs some time to go more in depth, please feel free. My contact information is on the last slide to reach out, but I'd like to answer some questions. I see there's some questions out there. So
Yeah, thanks, Nate. And I know the most burning question right now on everyone's minds is they really want to see your documents, your SOPs, and job descriptions. Unfortunately, our screen share, there's a technical difficulty and we couldn't see some of those resources. So we could certainly get those added to our conference webpage later today. That's been our #1 question. But another one I wanted to ask is on behalf of Henley Center. She is with New England Healing Sports Association, and their volunteers, they vary in attendance and their participants as well. So if you don't have the same people week after week, but you have people that could do really well in a volunteer leadership position when they are there, do you have any advice for how to select those volunteer leaders or criteria to set in order to make sure that you are building a strong leadership team?
Sure. I think, thanks for the question, Henley. I think I would look at who are those volunteers that come back regularly and are often there, even if you're not running that seasonal programming like we do. Look for those that are consistently there, that have the experience in that program, and you think would be capable of stepping up into that role. And then you could certainly have a couple that are available, and the ones, if one volunteer leader was available for that day, they could take that role, and another volunteer leader the next day.
Great. And another question coming from Tara in Mount Snow. She's asking how many lessons or experiences you give in the winter season and the summer season.
So winter by far is our busiest. We have 6 days a week of alpine in the winter, and we run a morning and afternoon session. And it really varies there as to from 4 or 5 people per session to, and some of our bigger ones have 8 or 10. But we also run hiking, snowshoeing, Nordic in the winter, some swimming, indoor climbing, bocce. Summertime, biking is our biggest program. We run 2 days of biking. We have kayaking. We have a walking group, hiking, a garden group, a social group. But we also run spring and fall programs, which will include some overlap with biking, hiking, walking, climbing, swimming. Plus, we run all of our Special Olympic programs. So we have an alpine race team. We have basketball, bocce. So we've quite a spread throughout the year.
Great. And another, just a quick question that came in. What is the age range of your volunteers?
Most of our volunteers, I think, are in that kind of older retired population, but we do see a big difference. We almost have 2 different groups. Our weekday volunteers are definitely in that retirement age, versus our weekend volunteers definitely can become a little bit younger. And so that does kind of play into our weekday, especially alpine, looking at who's going to be able to take equipment lessons out. And that's a big reason why our volunteer leaders are often out on lessons. We just don't have enough people to do the heavier kind of equipment lessons that we want to get out.
And I think we have time for one more question. You could maybe give some advice from your personal experience here. How might you handle a situation where a volunteer is really excited and wants to pursue being in a leadership role, but they're not a good fit? Has that happened in your experience, or what might you suggest if someone is faced with that?
That's a great question. I don't think our program that we've really had that yet. But that's kind of what I'm hoping the assistant volunteer leader will do, is it'll allow them to still step up a little bit, but let us kind of have someone else who's still in charge and kind of help them grow and guide them into what it would take to develop into a good volunteer leader. But still something, like I said, we're still kind of learning and growing with as well. By no means do we have a complete system yet, but that's kind of my hope for the assistant.
Great. And we're coming up on time here. So I just want to thank you, Nate, for being here today. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to every question in the box here, but we'll share those with you. And also feel free to contact Nate and visit our conference webpage to download those resources. We'll get that updated for you all. Also, the recording from this presentation will be shared on YouTube and also be closed captioned, so you can catch that over there. In the chat box, you will find a link for our session survey. We really appreciate your feedback. It helps us improve and serve you better, so make sure you take a few moments to fill out that survey when you close out of Zoom.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And we will see you all back at 4:30 for our closing keynote. Don't miss it.